Welcome to Mystery Stories, a place where quiet villages hide deep secrets and every gentle conversation may carry a hidden clue. Here, classic cozy mysteries unfold through calm narration, clever observations, and unforgettable twists. Settle in, relax, and let each story draw you into a world of suspense, charm, and timeless detective storytelling, where mysteries are solved not by noise, but by patience and insight. Chapter 1. The first whisper reached Miss Marple before she had even properly set down her suitcase. It came in the form of a lowered voice behind her at the village post office, the sort of voice meant to be private and therefore instantly interesting. Two ladies stood near the counter, pretending to examine greeting cards, yet speaking with the careful softness reserved for matters everyone wished to discuss, but no one wished to own. Such a pity about the garden, one murmured. At this time of year, too. Nothing at all coming up. And after all that money, the other replied. Though I always say, some things simply refuse to grow where they ought not. The moment Miss Marple stepped closer, the conversation dissolved into cheerful remarks about postage stamps and the weather. She greeted them kindly, accepting their smiles with gentle innocence, yet she carried the tone of that exchange with her as she stepped out into the mild spring air of St. Briarwood. The village looked exactly as an English village should in early spring, hedges greening cautiously, windows open just enough to invite warmth, and the faint scent of damp earth promising renewal. Bunting already stretched across the green in preparation for the annual 50, fluttering lazily as though the village itself anticipated celebration. Yet beneath the pleasantness lingered a curious restraint. People smiled, certainly, but their attention drifted often toward the distant lane leading to Rosebank Cottage. Miss Marple noticed such things immediately. She had come at the invitation of Mrs. Edith Linton, an old acquaintance who believed a quiet visit would do them both good. Edith met her at the gate with enthusiasm slightly too energetic for casual happiness. My dear Miss Marple, you could not have chosen a better time. The 50 preparations are quite underway, though, she added, lowering her voice as they walked. There has been rather a shadow over things this year. Miss Marple tilted her head politely. Indeed? Oh, Rosebank Cottage, Edith said, as though the name itself explained everything. Such a disappointment. The Harcourt garden used to be the pride of the village. They passed cottages bright with tulips and daffodils, each garden alive with color. Birds moved busily among hedges, and somewhere a child laughed. The contrast made Edith's next words feel heavier. Nothing grows there now, she said. Not properly. Quite unnatural, if you ask me. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched a gardener across the road pause in his work as Rosebank Cottage came into view at the end of the lane. He stared a moment too long before returning abruptly to trimming hedges, a small reaction easily missed. But not by Miss Marple. Rosebank Cottage itself was charming, ivy climbing pale stone walls, wide windows, and a garden large enough to suggest years of careful devotion. Yet the flower beds lay strangely bare. Soil appeared recently turned, but no shoots emerged. Even the grass seemed reluctant. It was not neglect. It was absence. Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt greeted them at the door with warmth that felt practiced rather than spontaneous. She was elegantly dressed, her smile quick and dazzling, though her eyes carried a tired brightness that suggested sleepless nights. Miss Marple, how delightful! Edith has told me so much about you. Her handshake lingered just slightly too long, as though reassurance were being sought rather than offered. Inside, the house smelled faintly of roses and polish. Everything appeared orderly, almost excessively so. Cushions aligned perfectly, surfaces spotless, windows wide open despite the lingering chill. Over tea, Mrs. Harcourt spoke cheerfully of the 50, the weather, and village improvements. She laughed often, yet each laugh ended a fraction too abruptly. Miss Marple noticed that whenever conversation paused, Mrs. Harcourt's gaze drifted toward the garden window, toward the greenhouse. It stood at the far edge of the garden, glass panes catching pale sunlight. Unlike the rest of the property, Its door was firmly locked with a heavy iron chain. "You must forgive the state of things outside," Mrs. Harcourt said suddenly. "The garden has been stubborn this year." "Gardens," Miss Marple replied gently, "often reflect more than weather. They respond to care, and sometimes to disturbance." Mrs. Harcourt's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer before she steadied it with both hands. "Oh, I assure you," she said quickly, smiling again, "everything is perfectly well." Edith began discussing 50 arrangements, yet Miss Marple's attention wandered to the maid entering quietly with fresh scones. The girl avoided looking toward the garden entirely. Her shoulders stiffened when Mrs. Harcourt mentioned the greenhouse. Fear, Miss Marple thought, rarely announces itself loudly. It appears instead in avoidance. Later, walking through the garden at Mrs. Harcourt's invitation, Miss Marple moved slowly along the paths. The soil bore marks of recent digging, not neat gardening work, but uneven disturbances hastily smoothed over. Near the path she paused. Footprints. Large ones, pressed deep into damp earth. Not the practical boots of a gardener nor the light steps of a lady. These were heavier, deliberate, and recent, despite Mrs. Harcourt's claim that no work had been done for days. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely adjusted her glove and continued walking. The greenhouse door drew closer. Up close, the chain appeared newly polished, the metal bright against older hinges. Someone had handled it frequently. She bent slightly, pretending to admire a clay pot nearby. The faint scent lingering in the air caught her attention. Sharp, chemical, carefully masked by floral fertilizer. Behind her, Mrs. Harcourt spoke too quickly. "I keep it locked now. Pests, you understand." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Yet pests did not polish chains. As they returned toward the house, the vicar's wife appeared at the garden gate, eager for conversation. Her sympathy toward Mrs. Harcourt flowed generously and loudly enough to ensure it was overheard. "Such courage after dear Mr. Harcourt's passing," she said. "So sudden, though I always felt the timing rather surprising, considering the financial arrangements." A silence followed. Mrs. Harcourt's smile froze. "Well," she said lightly, "these things cannot be helped." Miss Marple observed the tightening of her fingers around a rose stem until a thorn pierced skin. Mrs. Harcourt did not seem to notice the blood. The vicar's wife quickly changed subject, but the damage lingered like a draft through an open door. That evening, Edith shared further village news by the fireplace. "The gardener left last week," she said, "walked out without notice. Imagine, after 10 years. How unusual," Miss Marple murmured. "He refused to say why, only that he would not return after dark again." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. Fear again. Not anger. Not inconvenience. Fear. Night settled gently over St. Briarwood. From her guest room window at the Linton house, Miss Marple could just glimpse the distant outline of Rosebank Cottage beyond hedges and trees. She prepared for bed slowly, yet something drew her again to the window. A light flickered in the distance. Not from the house. From the greenhouse. It glowed faintly, briefly obscured as though someone moved inside. Miss Marple watched without alarm, only quiet attention. The light vanished after several moments, leaving darkness behind. No alarm was raised. No servant hurried across the grounds. The village slept peacefully, which meant whoever visited the greenhouse expected secrecy. The next morning brought cheerful preparations for the 50, laughter echoing across the green. Yet conversations paused when Miss Marple approached Rosebank Cottage again. She heard fragments, late at night, shouldn't be alone, after what happened. Gossip, she knew, was rarely invention. It was truth softened by politeness. As she stood once more beside the barren flower beds, Miss Marple studied the earth carefully. Beneath the surface lay signs of repeated disturbance. Soil turned, pressed down, and turned again. Gardens did not behave this way without reason. Mrs. Harcourt joined her, smiling brightly despite visible fatigue. "Do you garden, Miss Marple?" "A little," she replied kindly. "Enough to know when something struggles and when something has been moved." For a brief moment, Mrs. Harcourt's composure faltered. Then it returned. "Well," she said lightly, "perhaps spring simply needs patience." Miss Marple smiled in agreement, though her eyes lingered on the greenhouse beyond the roses. Somewhere nearby, a crow called sharply, breaking the stillness, and as Miss Marple turned back toward the house, she felt with quiet certainty that this was not merely a garden failing to bloom. Someone had been entering that locked greenhouse under cover of darkness, and Miss Marple, smiling gently as though admiring nothing more than stubborn soil, knew she had just seen the first careful shadow of something meant never to be discovered, and wondered who continued to visit a garden that refused to grow. Chapter 2. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a confession, nor from an argument, but from laughter that lasted a moment too long. Miss Marple noticed it the instant she entered the Bluebell Tea Room the following afternoon. The little shop sat at the corner of St. Briarwood Square, its windows fogged gently by steam and scented with fresh scones and strong tea. It was the sort of place where conversation flowed freely, provided one understood how to listen between the words rather than to them. Mrs. Linton waved her over eagerly. "Miss Marple, here. We've saved you the comfortable chair." Around the table sat several village ladies already deep in discussion. Cups clinked softly, spoons stirred with polite rhythm, and smiles appeared the moment Miss Marple approached. Smiles carrying the unmistakable brightness of interrupted gossip. "How lovely to see you settling in," said Mrs. Cartwright, leaning forward. "You've met Mrs. Harcourt already, I imagine?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "A most charming hostess." There was a brief silence, followed by that laughter again, light, agreeable, and entirely insincere. "Oh yes," Mrs. Cartwright said. "Charming." Miss Marple accepted her tea and allowed the conversation to unfold naturally. She never hurried such moments. Villages revealed themselves best when left undisturbed. The talk turned to 50 preparations, flower arrangements, and raffle prizes. Yet Mrs. Harcourt's name surfaced repeatedly, each mention wrapped carefully in sympathy. "And of course," said Mrs. Linton, lowering her voice slightly, "her niece arriving when she did must have been a comfort." "Clara?" Another woman added. "Yes, though rather sudden, wasn't it?" Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Her niece has returned recently?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Cartwright said. "From abroad, somewhere. No one seems quite certain where. France, perhaps. Or Italy. She speaks beautifully, though." And arrived just after poor Mr. Harcourt passed, added another voice softly. A pause followed, filled only by the delicate pouring of tea. Miss Marple noticed how each woman avoided meeting the other's eyes. Gossip restrained by manners was always the most revealing kind. At that moment the tea-room door opened, admitting a young woman carrying gloves and a small handbag. She was strikingly composed, dressed with understated elegance, though her expression carried faint strain beneath its calm surface. Mrs. Linton leaned closer. "Speak of the subject." Clara Harcourt approached their table with polite confidence. "My aunt hopes you are settling comfortably, Miss Marple," she said warmly. "She speaks very highly of you already." "How kind," Miss Marple replied, studying her gently. Clara's smile was sincere, yet her hands betrayed her. She removed her gloves quickly and placed them beside her cup, and Miss Marple noticed faint dark smudges along the fingertips. Ink stains, not fresh enough to glisten, but recent enough to resist washing. "How industrious you have been," Miss Marple remarked lightly. Clara glanced down, startled. "Oh, letters. 50 arrangements." Her explanation came quickly, almost rehearsed. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. Though she observed that Clara had earlier claimed to Mrs. Linton she spent the morning walking through the countryside. People rarely noticed contradictions in their own stories. Conversation continued, drifting toward village finances and charity funds. At the mention of estates and inheritances, Clara's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders stiffened, her smile tightened. Miss Marple pretended great interest in her sponge cake while quietly filing the reaction away. Colonel Ashford soon joined them, a tall, dignified man whose military bearing softened only slightly with age. He greeted the ladies warmly, though his attention lingered on Clara longer than politeness required. "Your aunt managing well?" he asked casually. "Perfectly," Clara replied. Again, too quickly. The colonel stirred his tea before adding, "Rosebank must be expensive to maintain now." An ordinary remark, yet the table grew oddly still. "Oh, Eleanor manages admirably," Mrs. Cartwright said briskly, changing subject with visible relief. Miss Marple noticed the colonel's eyes narrow faintly, as though measuring reactions rather than conversation. Then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "Insurance matters alone can be quite troublesome after a death. I remember advising Harcourt about policies last year." Clara's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Did you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Quite necessary adjustments, as I recall." Miss Marple felt the smallest stirring of interest. Insurance changes before a sudden death were rarely meaningless. The subject shifted again, laughter returning. Yet the atmosphere had altered. Beneath polite exchanges ran an undercurrent of unease, like a draft no one acknowledged. As the gathering ended, Miss Marple lingered to pay for her tea. The tea-room owner leaned closer confidentially. "Such a shame about the gardener," she whispered. "Wouldn't say why he left. Only that he wouldn't go near that greenhouse after sunset." Miss Marple raised her brows mildly. "Indeed?" The woman nodded. "Said he heard someone walking there nights. Thought it was thieves at first. And was it?" The owner hesitated. "Well, nothing was ever taken." Miss Marple stepped outside into soft afternoon sunlight, thoughtful. If nothing was stolen, then someone visited not to take, but to check, or to hide. She walked slowly toward Rosebank Cottage, observing small details along the lane. Villagers greeted her warmly, yet conversation faltered whenever the Harcourt house came into view. Near the gate she encountered the maid from the previous day carrying a basket. The girl startled visibly upon seeing her. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said kindly. "Yes, ma'am, you seem busy." The maid hesitated before replying, "Mrs. Harcourt likes everything kept proper." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the greenhouse. Fear again, quiet but unmistakable. Miss Marple continued into the garden alone. The afternoon light revealed more clearly what she had sensed before: patches of soil recently disturbed and then carefully leveled. Not gardening. Correction. Someone correcting evidence. She paused beside a rose bed and noticed something new: faint scrape marks near the path, as though something heavy had been dragged and later repositioned. The marks led only partway toward the greenhouse before disappearing. A careful person would have erased them completely. A hurried one would not. From inside the house came raised voices, quickly lowered as a window shut. Miss Marple caught only fragments. "Cannot continue." "No choice. People will notice." Silence followed. Moments later, Clara emerged, smiling too brightly upon seeing Miss Marple. "Enjoying the garden?" "Very much," Miss Marple replied, "though gardens do sometimes reflect the anxieties of their owners." Clara laughed softly, yet her gaze shifted toward the greenhouse, lingering with unmistakable worry. "You mustn't believe village gossip," she said. "My dear," Miss Marple answered gently, "village gossip is rarely entirely wrong, only incomplete." Clara seemed about to reply, then stopped herself. Another secret withheld. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the Linton house. Over supper, Edith shared fresh news. "The solicitor visited Rosebank today," she said. "Stayed nearly an hour. Looked quite uncomfortable leaving." Miss Marple buttered her bread thoughtfully. "Legal matters after a death often linger. Yes, though this is nearly a year later." Outside, twilight settled peacefully over St. Briarwood. Lamps glowed warmly in cottage windows, and distant laughter drifted from the village green. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts remained with the tea-room conversation, ink-stained gloves, insurance policies, frightened servants, and midnight visitors to a locked greenhouse. Each detail small, each detail ordinary. Together, deeply troubling. Later that night, she stood again at her window. The air was still, the village quiet, and once more, faint but unmistakable, a light flickered within the greenhouse at Rosebank Cottage. Not briefly this time. It moved. Someone inside walked slowly from one end to the other, pausing as though searching or checking something carefully hidden. The light vanished suddenly. Miss Marple remained at the window a long while, her expression calm but thoughtful, because she now felt certain of one thing. Someone in St. Briarwood was not merely guarding a secret. Someone was afraid that secret might already be known. And as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple wondered gently, though with growing certainty, whether Mr. Harcourt's death had truly ended anything at all, or whether it had simply begun a silence the entire village was trying very hard to maintain. Chapter 3. The invitation arrived the next morning, written in a careful, elegant hand, though the ink had blotted slightly in places, as if the writer's thoughts had outrun her composure. Mrs. Harcourt requested the pleasure of Miss Marple's company to view the greenhouse improvements. A perfectly ordinary invitation, yet one that caused Mrs. Linton to raise her eyebrows meaningfully over breakfast. "Well," Edith said, spreading marmalade with unnecessary attention, "that is rather unexpected. Eleanor has hardly allowed anyone near the greenhouse lately." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps she wishes to reassure herself that everything appears quite normal. Edith gave a small laugh. "My dear Miss Marple, nothing in St. Briarwood has appeared normal since last spring." The morning air carried a gentle warmth as Miss Marple walked toward Rosebank Cottage. Bees drifted lazily among hedges, and somewhere nearby a gardener whistled, though the cheerful sound faded as she approached the Harcourt property, as if even birds sensed the change in atmosphere. Mrs. Harcourt greeted her at once, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. "How kind of you to come," she said. "I thought you might enjoy seeing the progress. One mustn't allow idle talk to flourish." Her smile was bright, yet her eyes searched Miss Marple's face with quiet urgency. "I always enjoy gardens," Miss Marple replied. They walked together down the gravel path. Miss Marple noticed immediately that the gravel had recently been raked, its surface unnaturally smooth. Too smooth. The pattern lacked the casual irregularity of daily use. Someone had erased footprints. The greenhouse stood waiting at the garden's far end, sunlight glinting off its glass panes. Up close, Miss Marple saw faint streaks where condensation had recently been wiped away from inside. Not the work of routine care, but of inspection. Mrs. Harcourt removed a key from her pocket. The chain rattled softly as she unlocked it. "I keep it secure now," she said lightly. "One hears such stories of trespassers." The door opened with a reluctant creak. Warm air escaped immediately, heavy with the scent of damp soil and something sharper beneath. Chemical, faintly medicinal. Miss Marple stepped inside. Rows of pots lined wooden shelves, yet many appeared newly arranged. Soil looked freshly turned, darker than expected, and several plants had been replanted unevenly, their roots not fully settled. "You see," Mrs. Harcourt said quickly, "I've been attempting new methods." Miss Marple bent slightly to examine a cluster of roses. "Indeed," she murmured, "though plants do prefer consistency. Too much disturbance can prevent growth entirely." Mrs. Harcourt's gloved hands tightened together. Miss Marple's gaze drifted lower. Near one bench lay gardening tools, recently cleaned, though faint traces of earth remained beneath the metal edges. The cleaning had been hurried, small details remained overlooked. A spade bore scratches inconsistent with ordinary planting. Deep, forceful marks. Not gentle gardening work. Behind her, Mrs. Harcourt spoke again, her voice a shade too cheerful. "The gardener was quite careless. I've taken matters into my own hands." "How admirable," Miss Marple said kindly. Yet she noticed how Mrs. Harcourt positioned herself subtly between Miss Marple and the far corner of the greenhouse. Naturally, Miss Marple walked in precisely that direction. There she paused beside a long flower bed. The soil appeared recently replaced, its texture finer, its color slightly different from surrounding earth. A faint depression ran along its length, barely visible unless one looked carefully. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "How curious," she said softly. "These were replanted quite recently." "Yes," Mrs. Harcourt replied quickly. "Experimenting." Miss Marple inhaled gently. Beneath the scent of roses lingered a familiar odor, insecticide, strong enough to preserve soil or disguise another smell entirely. She said nothing. Outside, footsteps approached, followed by raised voices drifting faintly through the glass walls. The village solicitor stood near the garden gate speaking with Clara. Their conversation carried tension despite their effort at discretion. "Documents must be accounted for," the solicitor insisted. "I told you," Clara replied sharply, "they were misplaced." Misplaced. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Harcourt's face pale momentarily before she turned away. "We should have tea," Mrs. Harcourt said abruptly. "The greenhouse can be quite warm." They stepped outside, yet Miss Marple paused briefly at the threshold. Near the doorframe, barely noticeable, lay a smear of dried mud higher than a boot would normally reach, as though someone carrying something heavy had brushed against it. Inside the house, tea was served promptly. Clara joined them, her composure carefully restored, though her smile flickered whenever the greenhouse was mentioned. "You must forgive all the fuss," Clara said lightly. "Village imagination thrives on boredom." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied, "though imagination usually begins with observation." Clara laughed, but her eyes lowered. The solicitor soon entered, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, "we must discuss certain papers relating to your late husband's estate." Mrs. Harcourt's teacup rattled softly. "I thought that matter settled." "Not entirely," he replied. "There appear to be discrepancies." The word lingered heavily in the room. Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly, watching reactions rather than listening to explanations. Clara's fingers trembled. Mrs. Harcourt's smile remained fixed, almost rigid. After a moment, she rose abruptly. "Excuse me," she said, leaving the room. Silence followed. The solicitor sighed. "These matters are most unfortunate." Clara spoke sharply. "Surely they can wait." "Unfortunately not," he replied. "Especially considering the changes your uncle intended shortly before his death." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Changes?" The solicitor hesitated, realizing too late he had spoken aloud. "A revision of the will," he admitted carefully. Clara went very still. Miss Marple felt the pieces shift quietly into new positions within her mind. A planned change, a sudden death, financial uncertainty, and a garden repeatedly disturbed. Conversation ended soon after, each participant retreating politely from discomfort. Miss Marple took her leave and walked slowly along the garden path once more. The afternoon sun softened everything, yet the greenhouse behind her seemed darker than before. Halfway down the path, she noticed something new, a small patch of earth recently scattered across the gravel as though shaken from a shoe. The soil matched that inside the greenhouse exactly. Someone had been there very recently, someone who had not wished to be seen. As she reached the gate, the maid hurried past carrying linens. The girl nearly dropped them upon seeing Miss Marple. "Busy day?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, ma'am," the girl whispered. "Always busy now." Her eyes flicked again toward the greenhouse, then away quickly. Fear had deepened into dread. That evening, clouds gathered early, bringing a soft gray dusk. Miss Marple sat by her window with embroidery untouched beside her, her attention fixed instead on Rosebank Cottage in the distance. She replayed the day carefully. Replanted soil, chemical scent, missing documents, a will about to change, and a greenhouse guarded more carefully than any treasure. Night settled. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as before, a light appeared within the greenhouse. This time it moved slowly along the replanted bed. A shadow bent low, working carefully, deliberately, digging. Miss Marple watched without surprise. After several minutes, the figure straightened suddenly, as though startled, and the light vanished at once. Darkness returned, deeper than before. Miss Marple remained at the window, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, because she understood now that the greenhouse was not being tended for beauty. It was being watched, maintained, corrected. Someone was ensuring that whatever lay beneath that soil remained hidden. And as she finally turned away, Miss Marple realized with quiet certainty that the garden of Rosebank Cottage was not refusing to bloom by accident. It was refusing because something beneath it did not belong among living things, and someone was working very hard to make sure it was never discovered. Chapter 4. It was during church luncheon, of all places, that the past began to sound inconsistent. The hall behind St. Briarwood's small stone church buzzed with gentle conversation, teacups chiming softly while plates of sandwiches passed from hand to hand. Sunshine filtered through tall windows, warming polished tables, and lending the afternoon an air of perfect village harmony. Yet Miss Marple had long believed that truth often revealed itself most clearly in rooms devoted to politeness. People relaxed there. Memories loosened. And memories, she knew, rarely agreed with one another when something had been carefully concealed. Mrs. Linton sat beside her, whispering commentary about cakes and attendance, while Miss Marple listened with quiet attention to conversations drifting nearby. "Such a shock, poor Mr. Harcourt," said one lady. "Gone in barely 2 days." "Oh, I heard it was longer," another replied. "Nearly a week, wasn't it?" No. Terribly sudden." The doctor said so himself. Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. Contradictions, spoken casually, often mattered more than deliberate statements. At that moment, Dr. Haydock himself entered, greeted warmly by the gathering. He was a practical man with kind eyes and a manner suggesting both patience and fatigue, the inevitable result of tending village ailments and village anxieties alike. Miss Marple waited until he sat nearby before addressing him gently. "You must have a demanding practice here," she said. He smiled. "Villages appear peaceful, Miss Marple, but people remain wonderfully complicated. Indeed they do. I imagine sudden illnesses are especially troubling." The doctor nodded. "Yes. Particularly when they progress unexpectedly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Mr. Harcourt's illness must have been distressing." Dr. Haydock hesitated, only briefly, but enough. "Yes," he said slowly. "Though curious in some respects." "Curious? Well," he added carefully, lowering his voice, his symptoms did not entirely match the rapid decline described afterward. Fatigue, certainly. Stomach discomfort. But nothing that suggested such a swift end when I last saw him. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps matters worsened suddenly?" "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested uncertainty rather than agreement. Before more could be said, another villager approached, drawing the doctor into conversation. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, absorbing what she had learned. A death remembered differently by those who witnessed it rarely indicated faulty memory. It suggested alteration. Across the room, the village chemist stood near the window arranging cups. Miss Marple noticed him glance repeatedly toward Clara Harcourt, who had arrived late and now spoke politely with the vicar's wife. The chemist avoided her eyes entirely. Such avoidance, Miss Marple knew, was rarely accidental. She rose and approached him pleasantly. "A busy season for remedies, I imagine," she remarked. "Oh yes, indeed," he said quickly. "Gardens as well," she added lightly. "Mrs. Harcourt has been experimenting with treatments, I understand." The chemist's hand froze mid-motion. "Yes, treatments," he repeated. "One forgets how many substances serve both plants and other purposes," Miss Marple continued gently. A faint flush rose to his cheeks. "Perfectly ordinary purchases," he said quickly. "Nothing unusual." Miss Marple smiled kindly. Of course. She needed no further answer. Defensiveness often confirmed more than confession. Returning to her seat, she noticed Clara watching her with subtle intensity, as though measuring what Miss Marple might already suspect. Clara's smile appeared when their eyes met, yet it arrived a second too late. Later, as luncheon ended, the vicar joined Miss Marple near the doorway. "Such a comfort having visitors bring fresh perspective," he said warmly. "Saint, Briarwood has felt unsettled since last year." "Mr. Harcourt was well liked?" "Oh yes," the vicar replied, though worried near the end. "Came to speak with me about putting affairs in order." Miss Marple's attention sharpened gently. "Spiritual concerns?" "And practical ones," he added. He mentioned plans to revise certain arrangements, said clarity was overdue. A will. Miss Marple felt certainty forming quietly within her thoughts. A man intending change. A sudden illness. Conflicting memories. Outside, villagers dispersed into soft afternoon sunlight. Clara approached Miss Marple almost immediately. "You seem very popular already," she said lightly. "Villages are generous with conversation," Miss Marple replied. Clara hesitated. "People talk too much sometimes." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly, "though they rarely invent entirely new truths." Clara's expression tightened. "My uncle's death was unfortunate, but natural," she said carefully. "I have no reason to think otherwise," Miss Marple replied gently. Yet Clara's relief appeared too quickly, the relief of someone defending a position before accusation had even been made. They walked together briefly along the lane. "You must find St. Briarwood peaceful," Clara said. "Peaceful places," Miss Marple answered, "often work hardest to remain so." Clara gave a faint laugh, though unease lingered behind it. As they reached Rosebank Cottage, Mrs. Harcourt stood in the garden cutting roses. Her movements were precise, almost rigid. When Clara mentioned the church discussion, Mrs. Harcourt's shears snapped sharply through a stem. "People should not dwell on the past," she said briskly. Miss Marple noticed a small prick of blood appear on Mrs. Harcourt's finger where a thorn had pierced her glove. She did not react at all. Pain unnoticed suggested distraction or fear. Inside the house, Miss Marple's attention drifted to the writing desk near the window. Papers lay stacked carefully, yet one drawer remained slightly open. A receipt protruded just enough to catch her eye. While Mrs. Harcourt poured tea, Miss Marple stepped closer. Garden compound purchase. Dated 3 weeks before Mr. Harcourt's death. The quantity listed was excessive, far beyond ordinary gardening needs. She returned to her seat without comment. Tea proceeded politely, though tension threaded through conversation. Mrs. Harcourt laughed frequently, yet each laugh ended in watchful silence, as though awaiting judgment. The sound of footsteps outside interrupted them. The solicitor arrived again, hat in hand, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm terribly sorry," he began, "but we must finalize matters regarding your husband's intended revisions." Mrs. Harcourt stood abruptly. "There were no revisions," she said. The solicitor hesitated. "He requested an appointment the day before he fell ill." The room grew very still. Clara stared at the carpet. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, observing. Mrs. Harcourt's composure faltered. Not grief, not confusion, but alarm. "I feel unwell," she said suddenly, swaying. The teacup slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor as she collapsed into a chair. Clara rushed forward, calling for water. Miss Marple rose calmly, offering assistance, yet her mind worked steadily behind her gentle expression. A reaction too strong for mere remembrance. Fear of exposure. Once Mrs. Harcourt recovered, the solicitor departed quickly, leaving unease behind like a lingering chill. Miss Marple took her leave soon afterward, walking slowly through the garden. The greenhouse stood silent, glass reflecting the fading sky. She paused beside the rose beds once more. The soil there seemed darker now in evening light, heavier, compacted, as though something beneath resisted settling. On the path, she noticed faint traces of white powder near the edge of the flower bed. She bent slightly. Residue, possibly chemical, possibly preservative. She brushed it lightly away, her expression thoughtful. That night, back at the Linton house, Edith spoke quietly over supper. Eleanor fainted again. How worrying. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, though I suspect worry itself may be the cause. About money, perhaps? Edith whispered. People say things were not as comfortable as they appeared. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Financial strain, a planned change of will, poison suitable for gardens, and a death remembered differently by those who witnessed it. Later, standing once more at her window, Miss Marple watched Rosebank Cottage beneath the rising moon. No light appeared in the greenhouse tonight, only darkness. Yet somehow the absence felt more troubling than the presence had been, because someone who feared discovery might choose caution, especially if they sensed they were being observed. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. She no longer believed Mr. Harcourt's death had been simple illness. Too many details resisted harmony, and as she prepared for bed, she found herself wondering not who mourned Mr. Harcourt most, but who had most urgently needed him never to change his will. For somewhere within St. Briarwood, beneath politeness and tea and church sympathy, lay the growing certainty that the first death had not been an accident at all, but the beginning of something carefully arranged and far from finished. Chapter 5. The letter arrived folded twice, sealed carefully, and delivered not by post, but by hand. Miss Marple noticed it waiting beside her teacup at Mrs. Linton's breakfast table, placed there with unusual delicacy, as though its presence required explanation before opening. A young boy brought it early this morning, Edith said. From Rosebank Cottage. The niece, I believe. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and opened the envelope slowly. Inside lay a brief note written in hurried but elegant handwriting. Miss Marple, I wonder if you might spare me a little time today. There are matters I should very much like to discuss privately. Clara Harcourt. There was no mention of tea or courtesy phrases, only urgency disguised as politeness. Miss Marple folded the letter again with calm interest. Requests for privacy in villages were rarely trivial. The morning itself appeared perfectly peaceful. Sunlight rested warmly on hedgerows, and preparations for the 50 filled the village with cheerful activity. Yet beneath the laughter, Miss Marple sensed a subtle tightening, conversations shortening when certain names arose, glances exchanged too quickly to seem accidental. Clara received her in the small sitting room at Rosebank Cottage rather than the garden. Curtains were partly drawn despite the brightness outside. My aunt is resting, Clara explained. She has been rather overwhelmed. Her composure appeared practiced, yet exhaustion lingered beneath it. She remained standing instead of sitting, hands clasped tightly together. You wish to speak with me, Miss Marple said gently. Clara hesitated, then exhaled as though surrendering to necessity. My aunt is being blackmailed. The words settled heavily into the quiet room. Miss Marple did not react with surprise. Instead, she poured tea calmly from the tray beside her. That must be very distressing. You don't seem shocked, Clara said faintly. My dear, villages contain remarkably few entirely new situations. Clara sat at last, relief mingling with anxiety. It began months ago, she continued. Letters demanding money. Always polite, never threatening directly, but they reference something hidden in the garden. Miss Marple's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. Do you have one of these letters? Clara produced an envelope from her handbag. The paper was ordinary, the handwriting carefully disguised, printed rather than written naturally. Miss Marple read silently. What lies beneath the roses cannot remain buried forever. Continued discretion ensures continued peace. She folded the letter thoughtfully. A curious choice of wording, she murmured. We paid it first, Clara admitted quietly, Small amounts. My aunt believed it would end, and it did not. No. The demands grew larger. Miss Marple noticed Clara's eyes glisten slightly. Not merely fear, but guilt. You returned to St. Briarwood because of this? Yes, Clara said. My aunt wrote begging me to come. She was terrified. Outside, faint voices drifted from the garden where servants prepared decorations. The ordinary sounds felt strangely distant from the tension within the room. Miss Marple examined the letter again. These phrases, she said gently, sound very local. Familiar expressions rather than dramatic threats. Clara nodded. That's what frightened her most. Whoever it is knows the village. Knows us. Miss Marple placed the letter aside. Has your aunt told you what the writer refers to? Clara hesitated. Too long. She believes it concerns my uncle's death, she said finally. Miss Marple waited. He died suddenly, Clara continued. People talked. Someone must think. Something improper occurred. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. And do you believe that? Clara looked away. I believe my aunt was desperate, she said quietly. Financially. Emotionally. Everything was collapsing. The admission hung unfinished. A knock sounded at the door, startling her. The maid entered briefly with fresh tea, avoiding both women's eyes before leaving quickly. Fear again, spreading through the household like damp through walls. Miss Marple rose after a moment. May we walk in the garden? Clara agreed immediately, as though relieved to escape the room. Outside, sunlight fell warmly across the barren beds. Decorations for the 50 added cheerful color, though the empty soil beneath them seemed stubbornly lifeless. My aunt insists on keeping the greenhouse locked, Clara said. She says it protects the plants. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the rose beds. Protection, she said thoughtfully, often suggests vulnerability rather than strength. Clara watched her closely. You think the letters are serious? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that someone believes your aunt fears discovery. They paused near the greenhouse. Miss Marple noticed faint scratches near the lock, recent shallow marks made by hurried handling. You see, Clara said nervously, nothing has actually happened. Only letters. Blackmail rarely begins with violence, Miss Marple said. It relies upon imagination. She bent slightly, examining the soil. Fresh disturbance again, shallow digging recently smoothed over. Has anyone else seen these letters? The solicitor, Clara admitted. He advised silence. And the payments? Clara hesitated. My aunt's finances are nearly exhausted. Miss Marple looked up sharply, though her expression remained mild. Nearly? Yes, Clara whispered. Rosebank appears grand, but there is very little left. A motive deepened quietly in Miss Marple's mind. Money lost. Fear growing. Secrets buried. A sudden movement caught their attention. At the far edge of the garden, a figure slipped briefly behind hedges, gone almost instantly. Clara gasped. Did you see? Yes, Miss Marple said calmly. They walked quickly toward the spot, but no one remained. Only disturbed soil marked the place near the rose trellis. Miss Marple knelt carefully. Fresh footprints. Large, deliberate, and beside them, a small indentation in the earth, as though a tool had been thrust hurriedly into the ground before being withdrawn. Someone had been digging, very recently. Clara's voice trembled. They're watching us. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, or perhaps ensuring something remains undisturbed. She noticed another detail. A torn fragment of envelope half buried in the soil. The paper matched the blackmail letter precisely. The blackmailer had been here, not merely writing from afar, watching the garden directly. They returned slowly toward the house. Clara spoke little, lost in anxious thought. My aunt cannot endure scandal, she said suddenly. It would destroy her. Miss Marple nodded kindly but did not reply. Inside, Mrs. Harcourt appeared briefly in the hallway, pale but smiling. Everything well? She asked too quickly. Perfectly, Miss Marple answered. Yet Mrs. Harcourt's eyes moved immediately toward the garden, searching. Fear had become expectation. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed a ledger lying open on a side table. Columns of numbers filled the pages, withdrawals marked regularly, increasing in size. Blackmail payments. Outside once more, Miss Marple paused before the rose beds. The soil seemed darker where digging had occurred. Someone knew what lay beneath. But the blackmailer's behavior suggested something important. They threatened exposure, but had not revealed the secret, which meant they feared it as well. That evening, as dusk softened the village, Miss Marple walked alone along the lane. A sudden movement ahead caught her eye. A figure leaving the Harcourt property hurriedly, disappearing toward the main road. Tall, broad-shouldered, familiar in posture, too distant to identify clearly, but unmistakably local. Back at the Linton house, Edith spoke excitedly about 50 arrangements, unaware of Miss Marple's growing certainty. Later, standing by her window, Miss Marple watched Rosebank Cottage fade into night. No light appeared at first. Then, slowly, a lantern flickered near the greenhouse. A shadow bent low beside the rosebeds again, digging carefully, urgently. Not searching. Checking. Ensuring something remained exactly where it was meant to be. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. The blackmailer knew the garden's secret. But the true mystery, she realized, was not who demanded money. It was why someone so desperate continued returning night after night to a place that brought them obvious fear. And as the lantern light vanished into darkness, Miss Marple wondered quietly whether the blackmailer was the murderer, or merely the only witness who knew what truly lay hidden beneath the roses. Chapter 6. The man opened the door only a fraction, as though prepared to close it again at the smallest discomfort. Miss Marple had expected hesitation. People who left villages suddenly rarely welcomed reminders of what they had left behind. "I hope I am not intruding," she said gently. "My name is Miss Marple. I believe you formerly worked at Rosebank Cottage." The gardener, Mr. Wilkes, studied her carefully. His hands, rough and soil-stained despite his new surroundings, tightened slightly on the doorframe. "I've nothing to say about that place," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That is often how one begins before saying something quite important. He hesitated. Curiosity, she knew, was stronger than caution in most people. After a moment, he stepped aside. His cottage stood at the edge of the neighboring village, modest and untidy compared to Rosebank's careful order. Gardening tools leaned abandoned near the wall, as though work no longer brought comfort. "You left rather suddenly," Miss Marple observed as she sat. Wilkes gave a short laugh. "Wouldn't you? If you found something you weren't meant to?" Miss Marple waited silently. People filled silence themselves when given enough of it. He rubbed his hands together uneasily. "I worked that garden 10 years. Knew every inch of soil. Then last autumn, Mrs. Harcourt starts insisting certain beds be moved. Said the roses needed changing. And did they?" "No," he said firmly. Roses were healthy. But she wanted that patch dug deep. Deeper than planting requires. His voice lowered. "That's when I found them." Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. "Found what?" "Bones," he whispered. "Not animal. I've dug enough ground to know the difference." The room grew very still. "She paid me," he continued quickly. "Said it must have been from years ago, before the house was built. Told me to forget it. And I tried, truly I did. What changed? The next day they were gone," he said. "Soil replaced. Smoothed over like nothing had ever been there. But someone had worked through the night to move them." Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "Did you see who?" Wilkes shook his head. "But someone else had been coming after dark. I heard footsteps evenings. Not Mrs. Harcourt's. Heavier. Careful. He?" "A man," Wilkes said firmly. "And not afraid of being there." Fear flickered across his face. "I left after that. Some things aren't worth knowing." Miss Marple thanked him warmly and rose to leave. Outside, the afternoon air felt unusually heavy. The puzzle shifted again in her mind. Bones discovered. Removed secretly. Night visitors continuing afterward. The garden was no longer merely suspicious, it was a place repeatedly corrected to hide the past. As she walked back toward St. Briarwood, Miss Marple considered another detail quietly troubling her. The poison. Her next visit was to the chemist. The bell above the shop door chimed softly. Shelves gleamed with orderly bottles, scents of soap and herbs filling the air. The chemist looked up and visibly stiffened upon recognizing her. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I wondered if you might assist me with gardening advice." "Yes, of course." She examined a display thoughtfully. "One hears certain compounds can be quite strong. Effective against pests?" "Yes," he said cautiously, "and occasionally dangerous if misused." His hands trembled slightly as he arranged bottles. "I keep records of all purchases," he said quickly. "I am sure you do," Miss Marple replied gently, "particularly large purchases." Silence stretched. Finally, he sighed. "It wasn't Mrs. Harcourt," he said quietly. "Not directly." Miss Marple waited. "Colonel Ashford bought it," he admitted. "Said it was for garden treatment." "Perfectly legal quantities," Miss Marple inclined her head. "When was this?" "Several weeks before Mr. Harcourt fell ill. Outside, a cart rattled past, its ordinary noise oddly loud in the quiet shop." "Did he purchase more later?" she asked. "No," the chemist said. "Only once. One purchase. Enough poison. Before a sudden death." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into sunlight, her thoughts settling into clearer patterns. Colonel Ashford. Respected, composed, attentive to Rosebank affairs. A man present at every conversation yet revealing little of himself. By the time she reached the village green, preparations for the 50 filled the air with cheerful chaos. Children ran between stalls, ribbons fluttered, and laughter echoed warmly. Yet beneath the brightness, Miss Marple noticed tension gathering among certain villagers. Colonel Ashford stood speaking with Clara near the church gate. Their conversation appeared strained. Clara's expression carried anger barely disguised by politeness. As Miss Marple approached, their voices lowered. "Cannot continue like this," Clara was saying. The colonel replied calmly, "It must, for everyone's sake." They separated quickly upon noticing Miss Marple. "Lovely afternoon," the colonel said smoothly. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, studying him gently. His composure was impeccable, yet a faint sheen of perspiration marked his brow despite the mild weather. A man under pressure. Later that evening, Clara sought Miss Marple privately near the 50 preparations. "I must tell someone," she said urgently. "I've done something foolish." Miss Marple listened kindly. "I altered financial papers," Clara confessed, "only to protect my aunt. The payments, the blackmail. I thought if accounts appeared stable, no one would question withdrawals." "You wish to shield her," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes. But now everything is unraveling." Her eyes filled with fear. "I never imagined it would go this far." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Loyalty often leads people into difficulties," she said gently, "but it rarely makes them murderers." Clara looked up sharply. "You think someone else?" Miss Marple only smiled faintly. As twilight settled, lanterns illuminated the village green. Music drifted softly, yet Miss Marple's attention remained on Rosebank Cottage beyond the trees. Patterns now aligned. Mrs. Harcourt, fearful, secretive. Clara, protective, but not cruel. Colonel Ashford, present, watchful, connected to poison and nighttime visits. And Bones once buried, then moved. Night deepened. Miss Marple walked slowly home, pausing halfway along the lane as movement caught her eye. A figure approached Rosebank's garden gate cautiously, glancing behind before slipping inside. Even at distance, she recognized the posture. Straight-backed, military precise. Colonel Ashford. He carried a lantern partially concealed beneath his coat. Miss Marple remained still, unseen among shadows. Minutes later, the faint glow appeared within the greenhouse once again. The light moved toward the rose beds. Digging resumed. Not frantic. Careful. Checking. Guarding. Miss Marple felt certainty settle quietly within her mind. The colonel was not searching for something lost. He was ensuring something remained hidden. When the lantern finally vanished and darkness returned, Miss Marple turned toward home with measured steps. Because she understood now that lies surrounded the garden, lies born from fear, loyalty, and desperation. But truth depended on a simpler question. Not who lied, but who had begun the lie first. And as she reached her door, Miss Marple realized with calm inevitability that the coming 50 would gather every suspect together, and someone, driven by fear of exposure, would soon make a mistake impossible to conceal. Chapter 7. The 50 began with music, laughter, and the comforting illusion that nothing unpleasant could possibly occur in a village decorated with bunting and fresh flowers. Miss Marple arrived shortly after noon, walking slowly along the lane as sunlight rested warmly upon St. Briarwood. Children ran past carrying ribbons, tables overflowed with cakes, and the vicar attempted unsuccessfully to organize a choir that preferred conversation to rehearsal. To any outsider, the day would have appeared perfectly ordinary, the gentle celebration of a peaceful community welcoming spring. Yet Miss Marple noticed at once that people watched Rosebank Cottage more than the festivities themselves. The 50 had been arranged partly within its grounds this year, a gesture Mrs. Harcourt had insisted upon despite her recent nervous exhaustion. Stalls lined the garden paths, carefully positioned to avoid the barren flower beds, while laughter floated politely over soil that still refused to bloom. Mrs. Harcourt greeted guests with determined brightness. Her smile never faltered, though fatigue shadowed her eyes. She moved constantly, speaking to everyone, as though stillness might allow thoughts to catch her. "My dear Miss Marple," she said warmly, clasping her hands, "isn't it delightful to see the garden alive again?" Miss Marple glanced at the decorations disguising empty earth. "Yes," she replied gently. "Appearances can be wonderfully reassuring." For a fleeting moment, Mrs. Harcourt's expression tightened, but she turned quickly to welcome new arrivals. Nearby, Clara supervised a tea table, her composure graceful yet strained. She watched the crowd constantly, searching faces rather than enjoying company. When Colonel Ashford approached, her smile vanished almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple positioned herself where conversation drifted naturally toward her without effort. Listening, she found, required very little movement. Gossip flowed freely. "I hear the solicitor is coming later." Such courage Eleanor shows. Though after last year, one never knows what people endure privately, each remark carried sympathy wrapped around curiosity. Miss Marple observed the colonel carefully. He appeared attentive, helpful even, yet his gaze returned again and again toward the greenhouse. Whenever someone wandered too near it, he redirected them with casual authority. Guarding, she thought. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. A small domestic detail drew her attention next. One of the 50 tables had been placed directly over a patch of recently disturbed soil near the rose trellis. The legs sank unevenly into the ground, forcing a volunteer to adjust it repeatedly. Miss Marple noted the colonel watching this with visible tension until the table was moved elsewhere. Relief crossed his face so briefly that no one else noticed. Music began, and villagers gathered for speeches. The vicar praised community spirit, laughter followed, and applause rose warmly into the afternoon air. Yet beneath the cheerfulness, unease threaded quietly through certain conversations. Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Cartwright whispering, "Eleanor looks thinner every day." Those letters must have frightened her terribly. "Letters?" her companion asked. "Hush," came the reply. The words spread like perfume, invisible but unmistakable. Blackmail was no longer entirely secret. Miss Marple wandered toward the lemonade stand, where the solicitor stood alone, visibly uncomfortable amid celebration. "A lively gathering," she remarked. "Yes," he said absently. "Though I fear difficult matters cannot be postponed much longer." He glanced toward Mrs. Harcourt. "She intended to make a statement today," he added quietly. "Something about settling affairs properly." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "A confession, perhaps." Across the lawn, Clara approached the colonel again, speaking urgently. "You promised this would end," Miss Marple heard her say. "It will," he replied calmly, "provided no one interferes." His tone remained polite, yet an edge lay beneath it now, strain-breaking through discipline. Miss Marple turned her attention deliberately elsewhere, allowing events to unfold. Afternoon light deepened into golden warmth. Tea was served, laughter grew louder, and for a brief time the village truly seemed carefree. Then came the scream. It shattered conversation instantly. Sharp, shocked, unmistakably real. Guests turned toward the greenhouse, where the maid stood frozen at the entrance, hands trembling. Mrs. Harcourt lay inside. Miss Marple moved forward calmly as others rushed in panic. The greenhouse door hung open, chain unfastened. Inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Mrs. Harcourt lay unconscious beside a large wooden trunk dragged partly from beneath the workbench. Its lid stood open. Gasps filled the space as villagers crowded behind. Within the trunk lay bones, carefully arranged, unmistakably human. Silence followed, deeper than any noise. Clara cried out softly, covering her mouth. The solicitor staggered backward. Someone ran to fetch the doctor. Miss Marple knelt beside Mrs. Harcourt, confirming quietly that she was alive, merely fainted. Then she looked around the greenhouse slowly. Details spoke clearly now. Fresh soil scattered across the floor, a lantern overturned. And near the trunk, footprints overlapping, one set small and hurried, another larger and steady. The colonel stood at the doorway, pale but composed. "How dreadful," he said. Yet Miss Marple noticed something else. He was not surprised. Outside, confusion spread rapidly. Guests whispered, fear replacing festivity. Children were led away, music ceased, and cheerful decorations suddenly appeared absurd against unfolding truth. Mrs. Harcourt regained consciousness moments later, weak and shaking. "It's over," she whispered faintly. "I cannot bear it anymore." Her eyes moved directly toward Colonel Ashford. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should allow everyone some air." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, murmuring speculation. Inside the greenhouse remained only a few: Clara, the colonel, the solicitor, and Miss Marple. The trunk stood open between them like an accusation finally spoken aloud. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "It seems," she said softly, "that the garden has at last decided to reveal what it was asked to conceal." No one spoke. The colonel adjusted his gloves carefully. "A tragic discovery," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, watching him. Though not an unexpected one for everyone present, his eyes met hers briefly. A silent recognition passed between them. Outside, distant voices called for the police. Clara began to weep quietly, realization dawning. Mrs. Harcourt covered her face, trembling. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the greenhouse door, pausing just before stepping out. Because she understood something essential now. The truth had not been uncovered by investigation. It had been forced into the open by fear. Someone had tried to prevent a confession. Someone had opened that trunk today, hoping to control what was revealed, and instead exposed everything. And as the sound of approaching footsteps signaled authorities arriving, Miss Marple felt certain the final answer no longer lay hidden beneath the roses. It stood among them already, waiting only for calm explanation. For the murderer, she knew gently, had just betrayed themselves. not through violence, but through the unmistakable panic of a secret that could no longer remain buried. Chapter 8. The garden was quiet again by evening, though nothing about Rosebank Cottage felt the same. The 50 decorations fluttered weakly in the cooling air, abandoned ribbons brushing against empty tables while villagers gathered in uneasy clusters beyond the gates. Word had spread swiftly through St. Briarwood, not loudly, but thoroughly, as such news always did. The discovery in the greenhouse had transformed cheerful celebration into hushed anticipation. Inside the drawing room, lamps were lit early. Their warm glow softened the tension but could not erase it. Miss Marple sat comfortably near the fireplace, hands folded calmly in her lap, appearing as though she were merely a gentle guest awaiting tea. Yet her eyes moved quietly from face to face, observing the small human details that revealed far more than spoken words ever could. Mrs. Harcourt rested on a sofa, pale but composed now, exhaustion replacing panic. Clara remained beside her, protective and anxious. The solicitor stood near the window, deeply uncomfortable, while Colonel Ashford occupied a chair opposite Miss Marple, posture perfectly upright despite the strain visible in his expression. Outside, the faint sound of policemen speaking drifted through the open window. Formalities would begin soon. But first, Miss Marple knew, understanding must arrive. It is always unfortunate, she began gently, when a peaceful village must confront truths it has quietly avoided. No one interrupted. She continued in the warm conversational tone of someone recounting an ordinary observation over tea. The garden puzzled me from the beginning. Not because nothing grew, gardens fail for many reasons, but because the soil had been disturbed repeatedly. Not planted, but corrected. Mrs. Harcourt lowered her eyes. Miss Marple went on kindly. Then there were the memories of Mr. Harcourt's illness. Each person remembered it differently. That is rarely coincidence. It suggested that events afterward had influenced how people chose to recall them. The solicitor shifted uneasily. Mr. Harcourt, she said, intended to change his will. Several people knew this, a decision that would have altered financial expectations quite significantly. Clara's hand tightened around her aunt's. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost sympathetic. Mrs. Harcourt found herself facing ruin. Appearances are expensive things to maintain, particularly when one's circumstances begin to collapse. Tears formed in Mrs. Harcourt's eyes, though she said nothing. The poison, Miss Marple continued softly, was obtained under the pretense of gardening treatment. Quite clever, really. A substance ordinary enough not to attract attention. Silence filled the room. At first, Miss Marple said, the death appeared natural, a sudden illness, mourned sincerely. But secrets rarely remain comfortable companions. Someone else learned the truth. Her gaze turned slowly toward Colonel Ashford. The colonel met her eyes steadily, though color drained faintly from his face. You discovered what had happened, she said gently, perhaps through observation, perhaps through accident, and you believed yourself justified in taking advantage of that knowledge? Clara looked between them in shock. The letters, Miss Marple continued, were never intended to destroy Mrs. Harcourt, only to frighten her into continued payment. Polite wording, local expressions, written by someone who considered himself reasonable. The colonel exhaled slowly. I merely sought fairness, he said quietly. Harcourt was my friend. Yes, Miss Marple replied kindly, and resentment often grows strongest where friendship once existed. She rose and walked slowly toward the window, speaking as though reflecting aloud. You watched the garden constantly. Returned at night to ensure the body remained hidden. When the gardener discovered bones, they were moved, not out of kindness, but necessity. Mrs. Harcourt began to tremble. I never meant, she whispered. Miss Marple turned gently toward her. Desperation makes people believe they have no choices left. Then she faced the colonel again. But when Mrs. Harcourt decided to confess, to end the payments, and accept consequences, you panicked. Exposure would end your control. Today, during the 50, You opened the trunk yourself, intending perhaps to frighten her into silence once more. The colonel's composure finally faltered. I didn't mean to harm her, he said, only to remind her what would happen if she spoke. She fainted, Miss Marple said softly, and in doing so, revealed everything. The room remained utterly still. Outside, footsteps approached closer. Clara spoke at last, her voice breaking. My aunt killed my uncle? Mrs. Harcourt covered her face. He was going to leave us with nothing, she whispered. Everything gone, the house, our lives, I was afraid. Miss Marple's expression held no judgment, only quiet sadness. Fear, she said gently, is a powerful gardener. It plants terrible decisions. The colonel lowered his head. I never planned murder, he murmured. Only justice. But blackmail, Miss Marple said kindly, is simply another form of cruelty disguised as reason. A knock sounded at the door. The inspector entered respectfully, removing his hat. Mrs. Harcourt, Colonel Ashford. I'm afraid we must ask you both to come with us. No one resisted. Mrs. Harcourt rose slowly, supported by Clara. The colonel straightened his coat, dignity returning like armor. As they passed Miss Marple, he paused. You noticed everything, he said quietly. Oh, no, Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. People always tell you what matters. One only needs to listen. They left together, footsteps fading into evening. Silence settled over the drawing room once more. Clara remained standing, staring at the empty doorway. Will the village ever feel the same? She asked softly. Miss Marple looked toward the garden beyond the window. Workers had already begun removing 50 decorations. Beneath them, the soil lay exposed at last, honest and unhidden in the fading light. Yes, she said gently. Villages heal quickly. Life insists upon continuing. Outside, a breeze stirred the rose bushes. For the first time, tiny green shoots were visible among the branches, fragile but unmistakable. The garden will bloom again, Miss Marple added softly, now that nothing is forced to remain buried. The evening deepened into calm twilight. Lamps glowed warmly across St. Briarwood, and ordinary sounds slowly returned. Doors closing, distant laughter, the comforting rhythm of daily life resuming. Miss Marple watched quietly, satisfied not by triumph, but by restoration. Because mysteries, she reflected, were rarely about cleverness alone. They were about understanding the small fears and quiet hopes that guided human behavior, the unnoticed details revealing truths people tried desperately to hide. As night settled fully over the village, Rosebank Cottage stood peaceful at last, and in the garden where secrets had once been concealed beneath careful hands, the first promise of spring finally began to grow. The village of St. Briarwood returned to its rhythm slowly, as villages always did, not through grand moments of change, but through small, ordinary continuations. Within days, the excitement faded into conversation, conversation softened into memory, and memory settled gently into the quiet fabric of village life. Rosebank Cottage stood unusually still in the weeks that followed. Curtains were opened each morning, though fewer visitors came along the garden path. Clara remained there for a time, managing affairs with calm determination that surprised many who had once thought her merely delicate. There was a steadiness in her now, the kind born not from happiness, but from truth finally spoken aloud. The garden itself became the subject of careful attention. New gardeners arrived, working patiently, turning soil honestly rather than hurriedly. Where the earth had once been disturbed in secrecy, it was now opened fully to sunlight and air. Villagers passing by often paused at the gate, not out of curiosity anymore, but with a quiet sympathy that needed no words. Miss Marple observed these changes during her morning walks. She noticed how people spoke of Mrs. Harcourt with gentleness rather than scandal, as though the village collectively agreed that understanding was kinder than judgment. Colonel Ashford's absence, too, was discussed less frequently with each passing day. Time, she knew, had a remarkable way of softening even the sharpest events. One afternoon, Miss Marple stopped beside the rose beds that had once refused to bloom. Tiny buds had begun to appear along the branches, small, determined signs of life pushing forward despite everything that had happened there. She bent slightly to examine them, her expression thoughtful but peaceful. Gardens, she reflected, were very much like people. When burdened with hidden things, they struggled quietly. Growth became hesitant, beauty delayed. But once the truth was uncovered, however painful, renewal often followed with surprising grace. Clara joined her at the gate. "They're growing again," she said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. They were simply waiting for honesty. Clara smiled faintly, understanding more than the words themselves. The Spring 50 was spoken of again the following year, this time held on the village green rather than at Rosebank. Laughter returned without hesitation, and children ran freely among stalls while music carried across open fields. Life, persistent and gentle, had reclaimed its place. On her final evening in St. Briarwood, Miss Marple sat by the window at Mrs. Linton's house, watching twilight settle over familiar rooftops. Lamps flickered on one by one, and somewhere a piano played softly imperfect notes, warmly human. She felt no triumph, only quiet satisfaction. The mystery had never truly been about deception alone. It had been about fear of loss, of change, of truth itself. And like the garden, the village had needed that truth uncovered before peace could return. As darkness deepened and the first stars appeared, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. For beneath the calm surface of every peaceful place lay stories waiting patiently to be understood, and sometimes all that was required to solve them was kindness, careful observation, and the willingness to notice what others preferred not to see. And in the restored garden of Rosebank Cottage, the roses bloomed at last, untouched by secrecy, growing quietly toward the light.